Hey everyone, so here's our video about writing summaries. Part of this is just understanding this tool set. Like I said before, as we're building up, the first idea was that we could read critically, understand what we were reading. Next step is then we can reproduce what we're reading in a shortened format. That's what summaries are supposed to be for. And then in the next assignment, you're off on your own doing it. So you guys will be practicing these skills up until about the midterm. So let's talk about when you're writing a summary, what we're really looking for, both for us and for you. So the idea here is that you're summarizing their whole argument, their main point, in one sentence. They are arguing this. As we said before, from the standpoint of a writer, you are not in this. You're not analyzing or critiquing or anything. This is all just you reporting what somebody else is saying. You need to sort of put on the hat of a good journalist, an ethical journalist, who only reports what they see and doesn't really critique it, doesn't examine it. It's just a reporting. And your job is to be as unbiased as possible in that reporting. So that's what we want. As we've walked through this before, there are two ways that we've sort of talked about doing this. There's the deductive logic, where we look and we see the main claim. And so anything where the author is saying in their first sentence or in their first paragraph, this is what I'm going for. Great, we know what they're going for. That isn't always the case, as we found out. We're here, I'm going to look at Book 2 of Plato's Republic. I'm actually going to show you both sides of this discussion, from the deductive and the inductive side, how we could see their argument. But for deductive, it just means that we see their main point, the big picture, and then we need to look at the little pieces that build up to that big picture. But we got that big picture sort of right away. Using inductive logic, we're doing the opposite, where we actually look at the little things because it was never stated. This happens a lot in writing, where the main point goes unstated. It's actually a really good sort of way to write if you want your audience to get the point without you being sort of pushy about it. And so for those things, what we're doing is we're looking at the little claims they make in order to get a huge argument together. And again, we'll be looking at how this happens in Book 2 of Plato's Republic. The evidence, a lot of instructors may not require you to quote. I'm actually going to require you to quote for a couple reasons. Number one, use for later. It's very, very common that the annotated bibliography leads to some assignment. And so if you get in the habit of using quotes in your summaries, you have the notes necessary to reproduce those quotes on larger formal papers. And so if you get in that habit now, you'll see how you can do that later. I'll show you in mine how I did that. I wasn't perfect about it. I didn't identify every quote I actually used, but a lot of the quotes were repeated. And so it would have saved me time if this was weeks or even months between assignments, which can happen in much later courses where it's a huge research area. The second reason is to avoid plagiarism. One of the ways that I often catch students plagiarizing, not that it's a terrible version of it, especially in a summary, but what ends up happening is they struggle to find synonyms for phrases or key terms. And for me, just you repeat them. Just quote it and repeat it and move on. It's far more efficient to just quote that key phrase or those key terms and cite them. You can do it in 10 or 15 seconds, than to spend the time trying to adequately come up with synonyms. And so these are the two main reasons why I'm asking you guys for quotes. They should help you actually produce better papers faster. It's just an efficiency thing. So these are ways that you can go about that. Now, the discussion section is largely just about moving along lines of logic. This is moving between their claims. I'm going to show you how I did it because, again, it's just about they said this, and then how did we get from this point A to point B? Because we have to get our audience there the same sort of way, summarizing the same way that the original author did. And so let's look at the deductive from Plato, right? We know about this discussion. Glaucon and Adeimantus really state they believe that justice is rooted somehow in an in-between place, which you'll see the quotes here in a second. It is neither the best nor the worst of both worlds. We also know that they believe that justice is something that you don't seek after for its own good. We know that because they have those three sort of classes of virtue, right? And the top class are things that we go after for their own good. And the examples I have here are the good food and wine. And the second class are things that we go after because they're not only good for us, but they're good for society. And in these places, we have things like learning, wisdom, right? And the third one are things that we do compulsory because they're just, because they're good for society, though we may not like them. I put taxes here. I don't know if that would have been true in ancient Greece. It's certainly true of today's terms, so we can all sort of get that really nobody likes paying their taxes, but we all should be paying taxes to the state because it's good for the state to get that money. This helps us identify that their main idea is the root of all justice is fear, because we can actually see it in the statements that in the beginning parts, which I'll show you here in a minute, they literally say that what we fear the most is that somebody can hurt us and we can't hurt them back, that we have no recourse. So if we were going with a deductive route, those specific placements of those language would help us to discern their main idea. But let's say you didn't catch it. Let's say you were trying to understand it from the perspective of somebody who did not catch it, that was their main point, which was the case for many of you as we talked about Book 2 of Plato's Republic. Many of you had trouble identifying exactly what Glaucon and Adeimantus were arguing. So let's go with the inductive way, right? So now we're just looking at the individual sorts of arguments that they use to build this argument that I'm making. I'm sure other people would disagree that it's rooted in fear. We can talk about it being rooted in ignorance, which is sort of what I think that their definition would be according to Socrates. Socrates' version is that the root of injustice is in desire, want, greed, those kinds of things. We talked about the 7 deadly sins there. But let's say we didn't catch that and we're trying to identify it, right? Well, we know. Now, those who practice justice do so involuntarily, and they do it because they do not have the power to be unjust. That's one of the claims that they make. In fact, that's one of the claims we could use to say that the deductive would have worked, because that's from the very beginning of the talk. But the next thing that they do is they go into the Gyges example, the example of the invisible shepherd. He gets the ring, he can go invisible. And the minute he can go invisible, he's seeking ways to use that to his benefit, right? And he ends up, stealing the king's wife, stealing a bunch of property. And at the end of that example, it says, no man, this is Adeimantus and Glaucon, no man would keep his hands off what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like a god among men. Then the actions of the just would be as the actions of the unjust. They would both come at last to the same point. So here we can actually see them talking about fear. What keeps that shepherd in step with everyone is the fear of being caught. But what frees him from that is a ring that allows him to turn invisible, which then allows him to sort of keep going and doing what he wants without fear of reprisal. This will inevitably lead to, well, the problem is that Gyges is a normal person. He is both just and unjust. Let's talk about these things in their quote-unquote perfect form, right? And so we get that. He makes a perfectly just man, makes a perfectly unjust man. The perfectly just man looks unjust to the rest of the world because he doesn't seek accolades, he doesn't seek things for what he does right. He just does what he's supposed to, kind of the way the Tao explains it, right? He is a just person in that way. He's very passive, does what he's supposed to. But the perfectly unjust man is seeking all those accolades, and everyone thinks he's the best person. And because of that, he is perfectly unjust because he's able to have that outward expression of justice while really just screwing people over all the time. And so we see that, right? And so through that example, we can see how this perfectly unjust man lives the best life outwardly because he has the most stuff, he has the most money, he's allowed to marry whoever he wants, he can actually bribe the gods, which becomes part of the argument in this case. At which point, Glaucon and Adeimantus finally get to this idea that parents tell their children to be just for the sake of character and reputation. And so they're telling their children to at least appear just because that's what will get them offices, marriages, and the things that Glaucon listed for the perfectly unjust man. And this leads Adeimantus to say that appearance tyrannizes over truth and is the lord of happiness. It's the appearance of that justice that is sort of tyrannizing over the truth of the just man. So if we took all this, we can actually see fear embedded in a lot of these examples, right? Parents fear that their children are going to go without, and so they tell their children that in the hope that for the sake of character and reputation, you want to at least have the advantages, right, accruing to the unjust from the reputation of justice. You should want to have the appearance of justice. From Gyges, the minute he's no longer afraid of the king because he can get away with it, he does whatever he wants. So it is fear that's largely allowing for all of this to happen. That's my take on it. But really what we need to do is we need to account for these examples. And all of these examples are in the text. And so whatever you put at the front end of that claim, whether it's fear or whether it's desire or whether it's whatever, that's what you're going to have to prove in these examples. And I'll show you the first and a half draft. I kind of edited as I went of how I would summarize this. It's a little bit long. It's a little over 500 words. But it's sort of what I'm looking for from you all. It was long for me because there's a lot to unpack here. It happened real fast in Plato, but they go through several examples, and we're just trying to account for all of their arguments. So here's the model, which starts with that claim. Glaucon and Audimentus argue that the origin and nature of justice is in the fear of the populace. That they're afraid, that's why they do just things. And then I start with the beginning. There they begin their argument in saying, notice that I'm, what we might say, couching any of my claims as they're saying it. And this is because they are saying it. I'm only reporting what they say. It's not my job to editorialize or analyze. My job is only to report what they say. And notice that I'm using quotes from both the inductive section and from the text if I didn't have it in the inductive section. But I'm using quotes to prove that they in fact said it, which helps me build ethos as well as having these for later as well as avoiding plagiarism. All of these are good things. So they begin their argument saying that now those who practice justice do so involuntarily because they have not the power to be unjust. I need to sort of unpack this because I've said fear and I haven't really made fear yet. So I say, in other words, the only reason a person commits to justice is because they don't have the power to be unjust, and they fear those who do have that power. Great. I've now connected my claim about fear to their idea about the involuntary nature. I'm attributing that involuntary things, why are they giving in involuntarily, to their fear. And then we can continue, right? This helps justice to operate as a mean or compromise between the best of all, which is to do injustice and not be punished, and the worst of all, which is to suffer injustice without the power of retaliation. And justice, being at the middle point between the two, is tolerated not as a good, but as a lesser evil and honored by reason of the inability of men to do injustice. I couldn't have rephrased that. I wish I could. I'm not that eloquent. And so rather than trying to dumb that all down into something that isn't that amazingly eloquent, would have been really problematic. It's probably why I went over on words, is these bigger, longer quotes. I don't think it's going to be a problem as much for more contemporary articles like Manhattan Project or other things. But they're speaking in a much more archaic form of English that I find it very eloquent. And I really had trouble trying to devolve that into, cut it up, do other things. No skill in my skill set was really going to be that, so do that sufficiently, so I just took the whole thing. Notice here, my discussion isn't about unpacking that quote. That's not my job here. I'm only trying to report what they said, so my discussion moves on. They quickly move on to prove their points. I'm unpacking my thesis. This is where they think justice is. Now, I'm going through step by step their claims. The first one is the shepherd Gyges, right? Who, with the help of a ring, is able to turn invisible. He quickly turns to this to his advantage, since he no longer has fear of the punishments of the state and has the power to be unjust. Quote, no man would keep his hands off what was not his own, when he could safely take what he liked out of the market or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure or kill or release from prison anyone he would. And again, it's a super long quote for this. But this list of offenses I couldn't reduce down. I could have, perhaps, but it would have been easier to just leave it. One of the things I could have done, now that I'm looking at it, I might have just said, no man would have been to keep his hands off what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked, period. Or end the quote there, and not had the list, and maybe just summarize the list. That would have been an option to reduce my word count. But like I said, this is, 1.5 for me. If you guys go through multiple drafts, you can be making these choices. From there, we talk about Guy just being an imperfect example because he embodies both injustice in his use of the ring, and his life before that was very just. And so he's not a perfect example. So we go into the perfect examples, right? They turn to the idea of the perfectly just man, sorry for the manned, perfectly just man and unjust man. The perfectly unjust man seems just and benefits from his injustice and therefore is not afraid of having anyone hold it against them. Notice I keep bringing that fear in. And I then use a quote to prove it, that this is their point, right? Because he has no misgivings about injustice, and at every contest, whether in public or private, he gets the better of his antagonists and gains at their expense, and is rich, and out of his gains he can benefit his friends and harm his enemies. His lack of fear allows for him to do all these things. And we can move on. They take the argument a step further, saying parents tell their children to be just. The quote shouldn't be, oh, nope, the quote is right there. This is a good lesson in quotes within quotes. So I'm quoting Plato at the front of parents, but at the front of 4, I'm actually citing a quote within the Plato text. So for the sake of character and reputation, the hope, blah, blah, blah. So then at the end, because it ends all the quote, I have 3. So if you're quoting within quotes, this is how it's done. Pay attention to that. And then this leads them to conclude that appearance tyrannizes over truth and is the appearance of justice that really matters, because that's what shields you from the sort of detriments of being an unjust person. So this is how you guys are expected to sort of go through this. The things we're looking for is that you're accountable to all of their major claims. We should have addressed all of their major claims in class, so you should know the major claims. Now you're just having to orchestrate it behind a topic sentence. The topic sentence should embody the meaning of the entire piece. So if it's, the whole thing, go with the whole thing. But your topic sentence should encompass what the whole paper, chapter, whatever is arguing. And then from there, you show me the specific assertions that lead to that larger conclusion. And that's the goal here. If you have questions, of course, ask me, ask your other instructors. But this should help you write good summaries. If you need anything, you can reach out. Otherwise, I hope this helps. Have a great day.